Good afternoon. It's always very challenging being trapped between a wonderful speaker and people's wonderful ideas about dinner. There is an expression in isiXhosa. It says, "Inkophe ziyakhumbulana," which means my eyelids miss each other. And this is about the time of day they tend to beckon each other. And so I hope to capture at least some of your attention. My fellow directors, Ofa Lapid and Nasser Abbas, who are joint MDs of Gear House, are unfortunately out of the country. But because this conference received the highest support at Gear House, they, together with my colleagues who are here, Joseph, Robin, and others, Trevor, some of the interns and technical team, have asked me to lead the conversation. My message centers on a very simple point, that the creation of a thick stratum of professionals within this industry is an absolute necessity. It's not a nice to do. It's a necessity, and I hope to demonstrate why that is so. But before I do that, may I take the time to pay tribute to Freddie. I've known him for many years, at some point at a distance, and at a further point along the line from up close. I must commend him for being a very consistent person, because he has harped on this message for a very long time. I suspect in that respect he has something in common with Orlando Pirates fans. We tend to stick it out through thick and thin. So thank you for your leadership, my brother, and I hope that we are energized as an industry to respond to the challenge you place before us. Perhaps I should start by introducing Gear House for the benefit of those who may not know who we are. And briefly, Gear House is made up of 10 companies. And each of those companies is focused on a specific area of the live events industry. And so at the top, it is, of course, the holding company, but Gear House System Solution into structure, Gear House SA, which has subdivisions, I will name, LED Vision, and we've set up a branch in Ghana to service West Africa. And under Gear House SA, we have a seat, set drapes, in-house technical management, which is the one that is positioned within some of our leading conference centers, Cape Town Convention Center, Sandton Convention Center, and numerous hotels around the country. Split Beam, Gear House, ICS, and of course the academy that we started in honor of our late partner and friend, Kensem Mphatlwa. Our location is in those cities, Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban, and of course Accra. And through our fleet in South Africa, are able to service the rest of the country, and of course the logistical service providers enabling us to service the continent and beyond. When we operate internationally, we tend to work, of course, with our alliance partners. The services that we provide, which form a portfolio that we've built over a period of 24 years, are lighting, audio, audiovisual, and power. Power, of course, is very critical at this stage in South Africa. We once used to have a dependable feed, and we are where we are at the moment. Rigging, daylight screens, structures, sets, ICT, grandstand seating, temporary venues. Temporary venues being those domes that you see there. I think that the one that was best publicized would have been the one we set up for the send-off of President Nelson Mandela. IVTM does the venue technical management, theater, permanent installations in stadia, as well as malls and other venues, and of course training, as I had said. So briefly, that's what we do as a company. I want to argue that there is a compelling case for developing human capital in our industry. And that case is based on the following. I believe, first and foremost, that there is a social imperative. If you look at the Lorentz diagram, which we use extensively in economics, that straight line that runs to the center is what we call the line of perfect equality. If you distributed the wealth of a nation between its citizens and everybody got an equal amount, you would run along that line, the line of perfect equality. And the further south of that line you go, the more unequal a country is. Now, South Africa, ironically, is not the poorest country, but it's the most unequal country because we have an unequal distribution of wealth, and I'll explain that a little later. We have a Gini coefficient, which is the measure of the gap between the richest rich and the poorest poor. That measures 0.63. We used to compete with Brazil for position number 1. We now have the honor of being the most unequal country in the world, a trophy I think we really ought not to be proud of. If you take the measure by the United Nations of what they call the Human Development Index, and it traces 3 aspects of human development: life expectancy, education levels, and standards of living. We are number 121 on a list of 186 countries that are tracked by the UN. Here is where the irony is. If you strip out inequality, which tends in South Africa to be a black and white issue, those that are haves become number 18 out of that list of 186. So they are 18th best off in the world until you throw in the inequality factor, which takes us down to 121. Now, you will see that from that HDI index, that if you attend to education levels, such as we are talking about today, you are immediately able to deal a blow to challenges around standards of living and certainly challenges around life expectancy in this country. So what we are talking about is not an imaginary challenge in the context of South Africa. It's a real challenge in this country. In 1996, we were on that blue line. And in the year 2009, drifted further south of that line. And so, of a population of 54 million South Africans, more than a third are victims of unemployment and poverty. And you'll see the income distribution. The bottom 40% earns only 1/10 of the income of this country, and the top 12% of the country earns 45%. Trickle-down economics in the context of South Africa simply does not trickle. And we have a huge challenge, both as a country and as an industry, to ensure that we elevate people from the bottom of those empty glasses to as close as possible to the top. Now, our people are making a loud statement. 3,000 protests in the last year. And those protests and other forms of expression have an immediate bearing on our industry. I don't know how many of you have been affected by this, but we certainly are affected by a number of cancellations that followed the xenophobic attacks that took place recently in South Africa. And so, as an industry, I think we have a direct interest in ensuring that we rescue as many of our people as is possible from that awkward position they find themselves at the bottom of that barrel. I want to argue also that there is a business imperative. Transformation is not merely something that businesses need to do as a philanthropic exercise. It's not a mere, and shouldn't be merely a tick box exercise. Because in essence, failure to transform is a serious business risk. And if you are in business and you are an entrepreneur, you want to mitigate as best you can all forms of risk. And this is one of them. The industry follows, of course, the general BEE codes. And those codes, if you do a comparison between the codes, and I know my fellow speaker will attend to this subject a little more. But the codes in 2007 dictated that of the elements that constitute the criteria for transformation, ownership was 23 points. It's now up 2 points. Interestingly, management control has gone down to 19 points. And when I inquired from one of my colleagues as to what it is that is the explanation behind this, I'm told that many of us have used it as a fronting opportunity. And people will take a gardener of theirs or a domestic worker and place them as a director in a company to get points instead of dealing with the issue. So my understanding is that then the weighting has shifted to things that will be the drivers of change, which are enterprise development, which moved from 35 to 44 points. And of course, what we are here to talk about today, skills training, which moves from 15 to 25 points. Now, if you score poorly in terms of that measure, your company, as we know, is less competitive, particularly in relation to acquiring business from the public sector. So it is not a nice thing to do. It makes business sense to attend to the challenge we are here to talk about today. I want to talk a little about our approach. As I said, we are a 24-year-old company. Our experience has been the following, that when we started, the industry was highly unregulated, still is to a large extent, and there were two pillars to the development of skills in the industry. The one channel was experiential and based on informal mentorship. The other was more theoretical, driven by training institutions such as Damelin and Allenby and others, who were very focused on selective paths, but the two tended not to work together. So if you were doing the theoretical program, you didn't have the practice, and the inverse was also true. The last characteristic of that era was local focus, because the country, of course, was subjected to boycotts. The events themselves were local and excluded international events. After 1994, we had a relaxation of those boycotts, and we began to see an increase in the number of concerts and major sporting events. Some of you will remember one of the first ones was the Rugby World Cup that followed the year after. And we've seen in South Africa, I have listed them in no particular order, artists such as those that you see there, and many, many more. And 1994 seemed to have opened up South Africa as a destination. Of course, our people and our weather, as we've talked about repeatedly, are themselves an attraction. And so there was a rapid growth in the industry. The second pressure point was ignited by production managers. We were wanting to see high standards, both in terms of equipment and production standards. And then, of course, the visiting artists and delegates themselves. And so one of the things that we did throughout that period was that we invested heavily in equipment, which I think resulted in us being one of the leaders in the industry. The nature of that change challenged us, of course, to respond to those demands. And so we began to formalize our experiential training. And we used the opportunity of the international productions we worked on as a training opportunity, as a skills transfer opportunity for our people. And we exposed our technical staff to manufacturer training, both locally. Alternatively, we would send them to manufacturers where we were sourcing our equipment for training. But whoever was on training would then have the responsibility of filtering that information down the line to empower as many within the group as possible. And later on, we participated in the writing of the unit standards for the TPS industry. But at all points, we were very focused on making sure that we provide opportunities for people who drop out of the education system, people who don't quite make it into university. And there remains a huge amount of those who are leavers in the gap between secondary and tertiary education. And those are some of the other issues that we had to do to focus on improving standards across all the markets, because our services extend the full range of those markets, hospitality, through corporate, through religious, television, and so forth. We set a common standard across all disciplines and provided on-site practical training for industry entrants on live events. Around 2005, I don't want to stumble on numbers. It has happened elsewhere. Around 2005, we ran a pilot program for 20 students. And the outcomes of that led us to the establishment in 2006 of an annual leadership program. Of course, we were sponsors of that, and the students received a stipend. The emphasis of that, the backbone of that, was the occupational health and safety standards. We've seen accidents in the industry that cast us all in bad light. And so we were very concerned about that. I mean, the nature of some of the services we provide is such that we are dealing with life or death kind of scenarios. Right? And we then took those who were the produce of that program into Gearhouse, and some of them, of course, have moved on to others. Around 2007, we did a re-evaluation of our program. We had produced 32 graduates in the first 2 years, but there were still issues that were a challenge, not least of which was the skills problem still. And you must remember that we were taking people who are also an outcome of a very poor education system. So the extent to which we can make an intervention is also determined by the quality of education people received at secondary education and below. We took the outcomes of that evaluation and we began to tighten our intervention. So the first thing was to focus people on specific career paths rather than give them merely a cluster of units. And if you follow that map, you will see the major categories as we identify them of the events industry, starting from the right being venues, marketing and publicity, management coordination, the creative, and of course our intervention is focused particularly on the service side and focusing and emphasizing the technical service component across those three pillars. The second thing which we did in response to our evaluation was to focus people on employment outcome and to focus the initiative on employment so that we create employment opportunities. And the third, of course, was to then broaden it to other branches. All of this initially we were doing through Johannesburg and subsequently through our other branches. Let me say that, albeit that we train at those three branches, a lot of the people on the learnership program come, in fact, from areas well beyond those. So they do come from some of the poorest communities. I bumped into one of my homegirls from King Williamstown, and there are many from many other communities who participate there. It's just that our physical presence is in those three cities. In terms of the outcome of that for the period between 2005 and 2014, we've produced about 287 graduates, of whom 16 are employed by Gearhouse and 52 are freelancers servicing the market. The colors there depict where the candidates were training, so Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban, and you can see what has happened over the years, that there is a more accurate reflection of those cities. Our centers throughout those cities are pretty much like that in size, Joburg being the biggest, and then followed by Cape Town and by Durban. In terms of the ratio of the candidates that have gone through the program, you will see that in the year 2011, we had 90% of them being black learners and 96% by 2015. And you will see that in the same year, 2011, we had 6% female candidates on that program, and in 2015, we had 21 candidates. And I think that's an important point perhaps to emphasize, because the industry is still male-dominated, and there is a need to bring a different dimension to it. We just had Mother's Day, by the way. Not that I think all women are mothers, but I think that there is something important to celebrate about Mother's Day. There are 7 billion people in the world, 3.5 billion men, 3.5 billion women, and then 3.5 billion which is born of women. And so at the center of our communities and of our society is the role of women and the girl child. And so I'm happy to see that we are making some progress in terms of accommodating that vulnerable group. In addition, we have, of course, been able to have about 7% of our candidates being from the disabled group. It's a challenge, as you can imagine, in certain segments of our work, but nevertheless an area of focus for us. I mentioned earlier that Kensen Patlwa was and is a late candidate, director of Gearhouse. He was very emphatic and very interested in this area of skills development. And we have rebranded the academy in his honor, and the statistics I've referred to that are an outcome of that. And we are now hoping to work with other institutions. In fact, I'm particularly delighted that there is this initiative, because one of the dangers is that companies are compelled by the actors I've demonstrated and by the realities of our country to do something. And what we should not do is to end up having disparate initiatives when we can be aligned. And I hope that this platform can help align our initiatives in a common direction so that the skills are transferable across institutions. I believe that the areas that are a challenge going forward, that a platform such as we are talking about would be of assistance in, is to look at this issue of extending the NQF level, which is still at 4, that which is available in the industry, to furthering it. I think that there is a need to create depth in professionalism by bringing on higher education that is a part of the training that we provide as an industry. Albeit that I believe that we should not lose the catchment area of those that tend to drop out after matric. I believe we can have an initiative that brings a coordination of the work of the SETA and the various departments that have a bearing in this industry. And so we look to the collaboration that can emanate out of conversations like this, and the working and the partnership that can be a product of this. If we have candidates who are better qualified, here's a small example of the difference that it makes in their lives. An entry-level freelance graduate can earn about 800 rands a day. If they were on a youth subsidy, as is proposed, I believe they would be on 1,500. So over a period of 2 days, you've earned what would be the equivalent of the youth subsidy. And for every other day that you work that month, you are in excess of that. And so young people would be much better off were we to channel them in terms of the ways that I have argued here. I think that the training also expands the supplier side of the labor market and makes skills available even at the lower end. There are many events that will not be of a commercial nature, but they still require the same expertise that we are talking about developing. And I believe that if we train our people, we can have a useful mainstay on which to peg the enterprise development, which is now weighted at 44 points. If you have people who are qualified, they are likely to be successful at the businesses that they establish within this industry. I want to conclude then by making the following observation. I was going through some waste at my house, clearing out my library, and I came across a number of newspapers dating back to 2010. And here are the headlines. Now, the interesting thing about the headlines is that they were scripted about us by others, but some of them by us, about ourselves. Now, that last one in particular, if you read how it is scripted, a journalist went to what was called Soccer City and ended up writing a story that the stadium was not ready. The argument was that the stadium was missing hundreds of panels, which ought to, according to the general, be part of the journalist, be part of the facade. Of course, the design was a design feature. It was a signature of the stadium, a stadium that has gone on to be celebrated as one of the best in the world. But that story stood for quite a while before it was contested. And nevertheless, it also helped further the negativity that was projected onto us, and certainly one that we seem to have projected about ourselves. I think that the quest that the industry faces is not about worrying about headlines. We need to get back to the basics and focus on the mission-critical imperatives. We need to do our bit to rescue those who live on the periphery of our economy, because it makes sense to help them become productive members of our society. And we need to do so. If we don't believe in the first imperative, then certainly do so because it makes absolute business sense in rands and cents. And if we are driven by this emphasis, then I suspect that what will become of these headlines is that they will simply evaporate and give birth to headlines we know are truly reflective. That initiative, 2010, was awarded a scoring of 9 out of 10 by FIFA. Midway through it, here is what Jerome Fokker had to say. There is not a single part of this World Cup where we have not been able to go beyond the level of past World Cups. South Africa will become the plan B of any future FIFA World Cup. And that was ultimately the product of the work of a large team of South Africans, yes, working with international people, but we should not undermine the firm foundation we have to build further training in this industry. Thank you very much.